I'm thinking to myself, do you all know who I am? And of course, I'm nobody. But I'm thinking, do you know who I am? Because I am somebody. In fact, I am actually a rock star already. Because in my heart, I was.
For decades, Stevie Nicks has been more than just a singer. She's been a force of nature. The flowing scarves, the haunting voice, the lyrics that cut straight to the soul, all of it created the image of rock's most mysterious enchantress. But what if the real magic wasn't just in the music, but in the stories hidden inside it? Stories of secret romances, devastating heartbreaks, and choices so painful they would follow her for a lifetime. Because behind the spotlight and the millions of adoring fans, Stevie lived a love life that was anything but ordinary. She fell in love with her bandmates, risked everything in affairs that could have destroyed her career, and carried regrets so heavy they still echo through her most famous songs. Every breakup, every betrayal, every forbidden kiss, it didn't just make headlines, it became the lifeblood of her music. Some loves burned fast and bright before collapsing in flames. Others left wounds she never fully healed. And then there was the one she still calls the greatest love of her life, the man she walked away from, not because she wanted to, but because staying might have destroyed them both. This isn't the Stevie Nicks you've seen on stage. This is the untold love story, filled with passion, heartbreak, and the secrets hidden behind some of the most legendary songs in rock history. And once you hear it, you'll never listen to her music the same way again.
Keith called me up, said, "Lindsey, would you like to join Fleetwood Mac?" Very much out of the blue. And of course, my response was, well, if you take me, you'll have to take my girlfriend too.
Before they were legends, before the world knew their names, Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham were just two teenagers chasing a dream they couldn't yet put into words. Their first meeting wasn't some wild rock and roll moment. It was simple, almost ordinary. A high school party, a room filled with music and noise, and then the spark. Lindsey, a quiet, brooding guitarist, already carried himself like music was his entire world. Stevie, the dreamer, had a voice that could silence a room even then. When their paths crossed, something clicked. Their voices blended with an ease that felt fated, like the universe had already written them into the same story. They weren't in love yet, not in the way the world would come to know, but the foundation was there, that mix of chemistry and destiny that would follow them for decades. After high school, they drifted apart. Life pulled them in different directions, as it often does, but fate wasn't finished with them. A couple of years later, Lindsey had joined a psychedelic rock band called Fritz, and they needed a singer. Without hesitation, he called Stevie. And without hesitation, she said yes. That one phone call would change everything. Fritz wasn't just a band, it became their training ground. Night after night, Stevie and Lindsey stood side by side, opening for legends like Janis Joplin and Jefferson Airplane, breathing in the counterculture of the late 60s and early 70s. The crowds were wild, the music scene exploding, and for the first time they felt like maybe, just maybe, they belonged. But the industry was ruthless. Fritz never broke through, and when the band fell apart in 1972, it seemed like their dream might collapse with it. Except they weren't ready to give up. Together, Stevie and Lindsey packed their entire lives into a beat-up car and drove to Los Angeles. They had no money, no safety net, just blind faith and a promise to each other. They were going to make it, or they were going to fall trying. Life in LA was brutal. The city didn't care about their dreams. Stevie worked as a waitress and even cleaned houses just to pay rent, scrubbing the floors of the very people she dreamed of becoming. Lindsey, ever the perfectionist, poured every ounce of his energy into their music. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was theirs. Every late-night songwriting session, every stolen kiss between rehearsals, every whispered plan for the future, all of it pushed them forward. And finally, in 1973, their first real chance arrived. They released Buckingham Nicks, an album that captured their chemistry in its purest form, his intricate guitar work woven around her ethereal voice. It was intimate, powerful, and magical, but the world didn't notice. No radio play, no hit singles, no overnight success. The album flopped, leaving them broke and questioning whether the dream was slipping through their fingers. But rejection didn't break them. It only made them hungrier. And then fate called again. In 1974, Mick Fleetwood, searching for a new guitarist for Fleetwood Mac, heard Lindsey play. He was impressed. He wanted him in the band, but Lindsey made one demand. Stevie had to come too. It was a bold move, but one that would change music history forever. With that decision, Stevie and Lindsey stepped into a world of fame, chaos, and success bigger than they ever imagined. Their love, their music, their struggles, all of it was about to be tested in ways neither of them could have prepared for. Because once Fleetwood Mac released Rumors, their story would no longer belong just to them. It would belong to the entire world. When Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham joined Fleetwood Mac, it was like striking lightning in a bottle. Almost overnight, the struggling blues band was reborn with a sound that was fresh, intoxicating, and impossible to ignore. Stevie's voice carried the mystery of a dream, while Lindsey's guitar gave it fire. Together, they transformed Fleetwood Mac into one of the biggest bands in the world. But success came with a cost. By the time the band began working on Rumors in 1976, the fairy tale between Stevie and Lindsey was falling apart. Fame magnified everything: the long tours, the pressure to keep creating, the relentless spotlight. Arguments turned explosive. The love that had once fueled their music started tearing them apart, piece by piece. And yet, instead of hiding from the chaos, they poured it directly into their songs. Stevie wrote Dreams, a haunting, bittersweet goodbye disguised as a love song. She sang of freedom, of moving on, but behind every lyric was the ache of losing the person who had once been her other half. Lindsey responded with Go Your Own Way, a fiery, bitter anthem that cut through the studio like a blade. Every chord felt like an accusation. Every line was a wound reopened. They weren't just making music, they were having their breakup in front of the world with microphones recording every word, and the world couldn't look away. The tension didn't stop with them. Christine and John McVie's marriage was collapsing. Mick Fleetwood was fighting battles of his own. Every member of the band was unraveling, yet together they created an album that became a masterpiece, an album built on heartbreak, betrayal, and raw emotion. The irony was undeniable. Their personal lives were in ruins, but the music was magic. Rumors became one of the best-selling albums in history, a soundtrack of pain that millions connected to. Fans weren't just hearing songs, they were listening to the sound of real people breaking apart. On stage, Stevie and Lindsey stood just feet apart, their voices blending in perfect harmony, even as their hearts drifted further away. The chemistry never left. If anything, the heartbreak made it more intense. Every glance, every note carried the ghost of what they once had. Audiences weren't just watching a band perform, they were watching two people bleed in real time, their private war turned into art. And yet, even after the romance ended, the fire between them refused to die. The love may have crumbled, but the connection never did. Decades later, as they stood on stage together, the echoes of their story still lingered in every harmony. For Stevie and Lindsey, the music was both a blessing and a curse, a bond too deep to break, no matter how much it hurt. Their love story could have ended here, burned to ashes by betrayal and bitterness, but Stevie's heart wasn't finished searching. While her first great love had collapsed, the next chapters of her life would prove just as complicated, just as heartbreaking, and just as unforgettable. Because as Stevie tried to heal from Lindsey, she found herself drawn into new romances, each one shaping her music, her identity, and her legacy in ways the world would never forget. After the firestorm of Rumors and the wreckage of her relationship with Lindsey Buckingham, Stevie Nicks was fragile, but she wasn't broken. She was searching for peace, for stability, and for someone who could understand the chaos without adding to it. That's when she crossed paths with J.D. Souther. J.D. wasn't the kind of man who stormed into a room with ego and noise. He was quiet, thoughtful, and carried himself with the calm of someone who didn't need to prove anything. A respected songwriter in his own right, J.D. had been a close collaborator of the Eagles, penning songs that defined an era. He knew the pressures of fame, the demands of the road, the loneliness that came with it all. But unlike so many others in Stevie's orbit, he wasn't consumed by it. For Stevie, that was magnetic. Their connection was soft, almost gentle, a contrast to the explosive love she had known with Lindsey. There were no screaming fights, no bitter arguments disguised as duets. Instead, their time together was built on quiet conversations, late-night songwriting sessions, and an unspoken understanding. For the first time in years, Stevie felt like she could exhale. J.D. saw Stevie not just as a rock star, not just as the mystical queen the world adored, but as a woman, someone vulnerable, someone still healing. And for Stevie, who often hid behind layers of scarves, lace, and myth, that kind of acceptance was rare. But if her time with J.D. was a balm, it was also fleeting. Their relationship never burned with the intensity of her more famous romances. It wasn't meant to change the course of her life forever. Instead, it was a season, a necessary pause in the whirlwind, something softer, something she needed before diving headfirst into the storm again. Still, it mattered, because from J.D., Stevie learned that love didn't always have to be destructive to be real. It didn't always have to end in flames to leave an imprint. And though their romance was short-lived, it reminded her of the kind of tenderness she deserved, even if she rarely allowed herself to have it. When Stevie spoke of J.D. in later years, it was without bitterness or regret. There was a fondness in her voice, as if she knew his role in her story wasn't to break her or to save her, but simply to remind her that love could also be gentle. And yet, gentle wasn't the life Stevie Nicks was destined to live. Because soon, she would be drawn back into a connection far more complicated, one that would ignite whispers, scandal, and songs that cut like open wounds. A love affair with someone inside the band itself, Mick Fleetwood. And that's when it happened. A secret romance that would shock the band, shake their friendships, and leave scars that even time couldn't erase. It began in the shadows, in the quiet spaces between the chaos of tours and recording sessions. Stevie Nicks and Mick Fleetwood had been through wars together, bandmates bound by the same madness, the same relentless machine that was Fleetwood Mac. But somewhere along the way, friendship blurred into something else. For Stevie, Mick wasn't just the towering drummer who kept the beat alive. He was stability in the storm, a man who carried his own scars, his own heartbreak. At a time when Stevie was unraveling from the loss of Lindsey and the weight of her fame, Mick felt like a safe harbor. For Mick, Stevie was magnetic, impossible to resist, a woman whose energy could light up a room, even in her darkest hours. But this wasn't a fairy tale romance. It was a secret, hidden, dangerous, because Mick was married. What they shared was intense, but it was also wrapped in guilt. Every stolen moment carried the weight of betrayal. Every late-night confession came with the knowledge that someone would be hurt. And yet the pull between them was undeniable. Stevie channeled that forbidden love into her music. Out of it came Sarah, one of her most haunting, deeply personal songs. To the outside world, it was a cryptic ballad, a dreamscape of longing and loss. But to Stevie, it was a love letter to what could have been, the whisper of a life that slipped through her fingers before it even had a chance to exist. The lyrics carried quiet sadness, a longing for something never real enough to hold. And behind them was the truth of an affair that shook the foundations of the band. Because in Fleetwood Mac, nothing stayed secret forever. When the truth surfaced, it left wreckage in its wake. Stevie later called the affair a mistake, one that hurt people she cared about, one she deeply regretted. But she never denied that the connection between them had been real. For a moment, they had found comfort in each other, even if it was fleeting, even if it was doomed. For Mick, it was another chapter in a life already tangled in love and heartbreak. For Stevie, it was another scar, another story etched into her heart and her songs. In Fleetwood Mac, love and music were always inseparable, tangled together in ways that were both a gift and a curse. Looking back, Stevie admitted the affair haunted her, not just because of the pain it caused, but because it reminded her of how fragile love could be, how even in the arms of someone who understood, happiness could slip away like sand through her fingers. And yet, just as she had always done, she turned the heartbreak into art. She made it immortal. Because for Stevie Nicks, nothing in her life, no matter how messy, no matter how painful, ever stayed in the shadows for long. The music carried it all. When Stevie Nicks met Don Henley, it felt like two worlds colliding. She was already the reigning queen of rock, her voice haunting arenas around the world with Fleetwood Mac. He was the mastermind behind the Eagles, a band that had captured the very spirit of California with their sun-soaked harmonies and restless lyrics. On paper, they were equals, two icons at the peak of their powers, survivors of an industry that chewed people up and spit them out. But in reality, their connection went far deeper. They saw themselves in each other, the exhaustion, the loneliness, the quiet ache that came with living under the relentless pressure of fame. Late-night conversations turned into laughter, and laughter turned into something more. For a while, it felt like love could actually survive in their world. But rock and roll has never been kind to love stories. Their relationship was tested by everything that defined their lives: constant touring, clashing schedules, egos, expectations, and the crushing demand to remain legends. Still, what came next was something neither of them could have prepared for. Stevie discovered she was pregnant. The news hit like a tidal wave. Both of them were still drowning in their careers, their lives dictated by recording sessions, sold-out shows, and a world that never allowed them to pause. There was no room for a child in the chaos, no space for stability in a world built on motion. Stevie, who had spent her life fighting for independence and creative freedom, was suddenly faced with a choice that tore her apart. She had always dreamed of being a mother, but not like this, not in the middle of a whirlwind, not with a man who wasn't ready, not when her music demanded everything she had to give. And so she made the hardest decision of her life. She ended the pregnancy. It was a decision that haunted her. The loss wasn't just of a child, it was of an entire life she might have lived, a version of herself she would never know. Don Henley later revealed that had the baby been born, they would have named her Sarah. That name became a ghost that followed Stevie, a wound she carried into her music. When she sang Sarah, it wasn't just a song, it was a confession, a memory, a love letter to something fragile and fleeting, something that slipped away before it had the chance to take root. For fans, the song was beautiful. For Stevie, it was devastating. The relationship between her and Don never recovered. The quiet grief, the unspoken weight of what they had lost built a wall between them. What had once been a blazing connection slowly unraveled, not with a dramatic fight, but with silence, the kind of silence that says everything words cannot. And yet, Stevie never spoke of Don with bitterness. She has said many times that he was one of the great loves of her life, a man who understood her in ways very few ever did. Their love didn't last, but its shadow lingered. It shaped her view of romance, of sacrifice, of the price women paid in rock and roll to chase their dreams. In the end, their story was one of beauty and sorrow, passion and regret. Stevie walked away from Don, from the family they might have had, but she carried the memory with her in every lyric, every performance, every whispered line of Sarah. Because for Stevie Nicks, love was never simple. It was always tangled with pain. And in this case, the heartbreak wasn't just personal, it was immortalized in one of the most haunting songs she ever wrote. When Stevie Nicks decided to record her first solo album, she wasn't just stepping away from Fleetwood Mac, she was stepping into uncharted territory. Fleetwood Mac had given her a platform, but Belladonna was her chance to prove she could stand on her own, as an artist in her own right. And standing beside her during that pivotal moment was a man who would become both her creative partner and, for a time, her lover, Jimmy Iovine. Jimmy wasn't just another producer, he was a visionary, a perfectionist, a man with an almost obsessive drive to bring out the best in the artists he worked with. By the time he crossed paths with Stevie, he had already built a reputation as one of the sharpest minds in the industry. But with Stevie, it was different. He didn't just see her as the mystical frontwoman of Fleetwood Mac. He saw her as Stevie Nicks, a solo powerhouse with a voice that could mesmerize the world all on its own. From the very beginning, their chemistry was undeniable. Long nights in the studio blurred into mornings. Songwriting sessions became confessions. And somewhere between chasing perfection on tape and unraveling the mysteries of her lyrics, the line between producer and artist blurred. They weren't just making an album, they were falling into something deeper. But their relationship was never simple. Jimmy Iovine was a man who thrived on control. He liked to shape the sound, push the boundaries, and demand excellence. Stevie, on the other hand, had spent her entire career fighting against being controlled by men, by the industry, by expectations. She had built her identity on independence, on the fierce belief that she would never just be someone's girlfriend or someone's singer. That tension, the pull between his control and her defiance, hung over everything they did. Belladonna became their love story pressed into vinyl. Songs like Edge of 17 and Stop Draggin' My Heart Around carried the raw intensity of their connection. Every lyric, every chord, every harmony was infused with the energy of two people who were both in love and at war. When the album was released in 1981, it was a triumph. Belladonna shot straight to #1, cementing Stevie's place as not just Fleetwood Mac's voice, but as a solo legend in her own right. For fans, it was magic. For Jimmy and Stevie, it was also the beginning of the end. Because success brought pressure, and pressure magnified the cracks already forming between them. Jimmy's perfectionism clashed with Stevie's refusal to be molded. Their love was real, but it was tangled up in ambition, ego, and the weight of what they had created together. Eventually, the same intensity that had fueled their romance started to pull them apart. The breakup wasn't explosive. It wasn't a tabloid scandal or a bitter fight. It was quieter than that. A slow unraveling of two people who cared deeply for each other, but couldn't survive the push and pull of their dynamic. Jimmy was devastated. He had lost not just a woman he loved, but an artist he believed in with every part of his being. Stevie walked away with Heartbreak, but also with Belladonna, an album that would define her for decades. Even after their relationship ended, the music endured. The songs they created together didn't just survive, they became timeless. Fans still feel the electricity of those tracks, unaware that behind the polished recordings lies a love story etched into every note. Jimmy went on to become one of the most powerful figures in the music business, shaping the careers of countless artists and eventually co-founding Interscope Records. Stevie continued her reign as the Queen of Rock, her solo career now immortalized thanks to the foundation they built together. And though their romance was brief, its impact was undeniable. Jimmy Iovine may not have been the man Stevie spent her life with, but he was the man who helped her find her voice outside of Fleetwood Mac, a voice that would echo long after both their names became legend. In 1983, Stevie Nicks made a decision that shocked even her closest friends. She got married. But it wasn't to a fellow rock star, a producer, or a musician. It was to Kim Anderson, the widower of her best friend, Robin Snyder. Robin had been more than just a friend to Stevie. She was her anchor, her confidant, her soul sister. The one person who had stood by her through the chaos of Fleetwood Mac, the drugs, the heartbreak, and the relentless roller coaster of fame. When Robin was diagnosed with leukemia, Stevie was devastated. And when she passed away just days after giving birth to her son Matthew, Stevie's grief consumed her. She couldn't process the loss. She couldn't imagine a world without Robin in it. And in the middle of that crushing grief, she convinced herself of something that, in hindsight, she would call the biggest mistake of her life. She told herself she could keep Robin's memory alive by marrying Kim. She told herself she could give Matthew the family he deserved, that she could step in where her best friend had been forced to leave off. And in the fog of grief, that decision made sense. It felt like a way to honor Robin, a way to stay connected to her even after death. But deep down, Stevie knew the truth. It wasn't love. It wasn't romance. It was desperation. A desperate attempt to cling to something, anything, that would keep her from collapsing under the weight of her loss. The marriage lasted just a few months. Stevie realized almost immediately that it was wrong, not because Kim was a bad man, but because their bond wasn't built on love. It was built on sorrow, and sorrow is not strong enough to sustain a marriage. She looked at Kim, she looked at baby Matthew, and she knew she couldn't be the wife, the mother, or the partner she thought she could be. When the marriage ended, it wasn't explosive or cruel. It was simply two broken people acknowledging that grief had led them down a path that was never meant to last. But the fallout was brutal. Stevie spiraled. She drowned herself in drugs and exhaustion, chasing anything that could numb the pain of losing Robin and the guilt of what she called her greatest mistake. That grief, that guilt bled into her music. Songs like Nightbird carried the ache of loss, of friendships ripped away too soon, of ghosts that followed her no matter where she went. Every performance became a quiet tribute to Robin. Every lyric, a reminder of the pain that had reshaped her life. Looking back, Stevie has never been shy about calling her marriage to Kim Anderson a mistake. But it was a mistake born not of selfishness, but of love, a misguided, desperate kind of love for her best friend, for the baby left behind, for the life that had been stolen from them both. What she learned was something she carried with her for the rest of her life. That grief cannot be rushed, healing cannot be forced, and love cannot be built on loss. Robin's memory never left her. Stevie carried it in her heart, in her songs, and in the way she spoke about friendship, loyalty, and the fragility of life. And though her marriage to Kim Anderson ended almost as quickly as it began, the impact of Robin's death and the choices Stevie made in its aftermath shaped her forever. Because some love stories aren't romantic at all. Some are about friendship, about loyalty, about the kind of bond that even death cannot erase. For Stevie Nicks, Robin's love was that story, and it was a story she would spend the rest of her life trying to honor. By the early 1980s, Stevie Nicks had lived through love in nearly every form: passionate, destructive, fleeting, and forbidden. But when she met Joe Walsh of the Eagles, she found something she had never truly experienced before: peace. Joe Walsh wasn't just another rock star. He was already a legend, a guitar genius whose riffs had become the backbone of American rock. But behind the fame and the chaos, he carried his own pain, his own demons, his own brokenness. Maybe that's why Stevie was drawn to him, because when they found each other, it wasn't about glamour or status, it was about survival. From the beginning, their connection was different. There was no dramatic whirlwind, no volatile power struggle like she had with Lindsey. With Joe, it was quiet, simple, sacred. Stevie has often called him the great love of her life, her soulmate, the one who understood her in ways no one else ever had. When they were together, it wasn't about the music industry. It wasn't about being icons or legends. It was about being human. They laughed together, healed each other's wounds in ways words couldn't explain, and shared a kind of intimacy that was rare in their world. For once, Stevie didn't feel like she had to perform, to prove herself, to compete. She could just be. But love, even the truest kind, doesn't always survive the weight of reality. Both Stevie and Joe were fighting battles they couldn't always win: addiction, exhaustion, the scars of years spent living in the fast lane of rock and roll. These shadows followed them everywhere. Nights blurred into mornings, highs crashed into devastating lows. They wanted to save each other, but the truth was harsher. They couldn't. Stevie once admitted that she had to walk away because if she stayed, they would have destroyed each other. And that was the hardest decision of her life. To leave not because she didn't love him, but because she loved him too much. Joe understood. In his own way, he knew it too. Their breakup wasn't bitter or violent. It was heartbreak in its purest form. Two people who wanted nothing more than to be together, but who knew that being together might cost them everything. Stevie carried that loss like a scar. It never healed. It became part of her music, part of her identity. Songs like "Has Anyone Ever Written Anything for You" weren't just ballads, they were letters to Joe, whispers of the love she had lost but never let go. Every performance was like reopening the wound, but she chose to do it because that love deserved to be remembered. Looking back, Stevie has called Joe Walsh the love of her life. Not Lindsey, not Don, not Mick, Joe. The one who could have been forever. The one she never stopped missing. The one who remained in her heart long after the spotlight faded and the years passed. It is perhaps the greatest tragedy of Stevie's love life, that the man she considered her soulmate was also the one she couldn't keep. Timing, addiction, fate, all of it conspired to take away what might have been the love that saved her. But like everything in her life, Stevie turned the pain into art. She immortalized their love in her songs, ensuring that even if their relationship couldn't last, the memory of it would. Because for Stevie Nicks, Joe Walsh wasn't just another chapter in her story. He was the chapter, the love that defined her, the soulmate she had to walk away from, and the one man whose absence she still feels to this day. Stevie Nicks has often been called a sorceress, a poet, a mystic whose songs feel like spells cast in the air. But behind the flowing shawls, the haunting voice, and the timeless mystique is a woman whose life has been defined not only by her music, but by her loves that lifted her, broke her, and in the end, shaped every note she ever sang. From the fiery chaos of Lindsey Buckingham to the fleeting romance with J.D. Souther, from the forbidden affair with Mick Fleetwood to the tragic love and loss with Don Henley, from the creative firestorm with Jimmy Iovine to the grief-driven marriage to Kim Anderson, and finally to the deep soul connection she found and lost with Joe Walsh. Every relationship carved its mark into her soul. Each man left behind more than memories. They left behind songs, dreams, Go Your Own Way, Sarah. Has anyone ever written anything for you? Nightbird. These weren't just tracks on an album. They were chapters of her diary, sung out loud for the world to hear. Stevie's genius wasn't just in her voice or her lyrics, it was in her ability to turn heartbreak into art, to transform the darkest moments of her life into anthems that still echo across generations. She taught us that love is messy, painful, fleeting, and sometimes impossible. But it is also the very thing that gives life meaning, the fire that fuels creation, the wound that becomes the masterpiece. And maybe that's the real untold love story of Stevie Nicks, not just the men she loved, but the way she carried that love and loss into her music, the way she gave the world her heart, piece by piece, in songs that will outlive us all. Because in the end, Stevie Nicks wasn't just singing about herself, she was singing about all of us, about the dreams we chase, the love we lose, and the ghosts we carry. And that's why her story, her music, and her voice will never fade.